Okay, let's unpack this. What if the standard way we approve new vaccines in the U.S. was about to fundamentally change? That's the intriguing situation we're diving into today.
Yeah. What's really fascinating here is a policy that seems to have just been announced, coming out of HHS, the Department of Health and Human Services.
Exactly. We're looking at an ABC News article here. It's from May 2nd, 2025 by Will McDuffie and Yuri Benajoud.
Okay.
And it lays out this new HHS policy. It seems to require placebo-controlled trials for vaccines that are deemed new.
Right. So our mission in this deep dive is to really try and get under the skin of this. What are the core requirements? What could maybe the ripple effects be for future vaccinations? And critically, what questions are still sort of hanging out there?
Yeah, what don't we know yet? We're aiming to bring some clarity, hopefully, to what could be a pretty significant development.
It seems like it could be.
So think of it like this. It's being spearheaded by the HHS Secretary, Robert F. Kennedy, Jr. And the policy basically mandates that for a vaccine to get licensed as new.
Okay, new being the key word there.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It must be tested head-to-head against a placebo. Often just a saline shot, something inert.
Right, in clinical trials.
In clinical trials. And this isn't just about checking if the vaccine works, the efficacy part. It's also about a really rigorous look at its safety profile.
Both things. And what immediately jumps out, I think, is how HHS itself is describing this.
Yeah.
Their own spokesperson called it a radical departure from past practices.
Radical departure. Wow. Okay. That choice of words definitely signals something significant, doesn't it?
It really does. A major shift.
But here's where it gets, well, really interesting and maybe a bit fuzzy.
Uh-huh.
What exactly is a new vaccine in this context? That seems to be the big unanswered question hanging over this whole thing.
Precisely. The article highlights this huge area of uncertainty. Like, does this new requirement apply to vaccines updated every year?
Like the seasonal flu shot. Or, the COVID-19 boosters we keep getting.
Exactly, those ones.
Right. And the HHS spokesperson did mention, apparently, that the yearly flu vaccine, well, it's been tried and tested for more than 80 years.
Okay, so that sounds like maybe it gets a pass.
It kind of suggests it might be treated differently, yeah. You can see the thinking, like, if it ain't broke, sort of thing.
However, the same spokesperson also indicated, and this is a direct quote, that the policy could impact the rollout of future COVID vaccines, which are updated annually.
Ah, okay, so there's the contrast. Flu, maybe not. COVID, maybe yes.
It hints that vaccines with, more recent development histories or maybe more frequent modifications might face this new hurdle. It seems complicated.
And adding another layer here, the HHS spokesperson apparently shared the view of the FDA commissioner, Dr. Marty Makary.
Okay.
Suggesting that even significant updates to existing vaccines, changes to tackle new flu strains, for instance, what scientists call antigenic drift.
Uh-huh. Where the virus changes slightly each year?
Right, like the flu virus putting on a slightly different coat. Those kinds of changes might be considered new products.
New products, implying they'd need this extra clinical evaluation.
That seems to be the implication. So even tweaking existing vaccines substantially might trigger this new requirement.
Okay. So the definition of new is still pretty murky, it sounds like.
Query.
But when they were pressed for more clarity, the HHS spokesperson just pointed to the gold standard of science.
Which, sounds very robust and scientific.
Sure does.
But it still leaves a lot of room for interpretation on the specifics, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It's a great phrase, but what does it mean in practice here?
Exactly. Now, to understand maybe the why behind this, the motivation, it's important to look at Secretary Kennedy's perspective.
Indeed. The article does underscore that Secretary Kennedy has, a long history of voicing concerns about vaccine safety.
Right. He's been quite vocal.
So this new policy seems to align pretty directly with his advocacy for using placebo-based trials. The idea being to ensure vaccines aren't causing, unforeseen harm. More harm than good, essentially.
Okay. So that's the push. Now, this focus on placebo trials is interesting when you think about how updated vaccines are tested now.
That's a really good point. As the article explains, the current practice, once a vaccine for a disease is approved, the newer versions, say for emerging strains, they aren't typically tested against a placebo again.
So what do they do instead?
They're usually compared against the already approved vaccine. The goal is to see if the new version prompts an immune response that's, just as good or maybe even better.
So it's like comparing version 2.0 against version 1.0, not against nothing.
Exactly. It's a measure of comparability or maybe superiority, not against a saline shot.
And it's also worth remembering, I think, that even after vaccines are out there, being used by the public.
Yeah.
Their safety is watched constantly, right?
Yeah.
Agencies are always reviewing reports of side effects, any adverse events. It doesn't just stop at approval.
Continuous monitoring. That's standard.
Yeah.
But, what's interesting is looking back at the initial COVID-19 vaccines.
Oh, yeah. How so?
Well, even though we were in a massive public health emergency, those first vaccines did go through rigorous placebo-controlled trials.
That's true, they did. Big trials.
Yeah, with huge numbers of diverse volunteers. And at the time, experts pretty much universally agreed that was essential. You needed it to figure out both efficacy and safety for a totally novel vaccine.
Right, because it was a brand new technology for many people facing a brand new virus.
Exactly. And going back even further, the article reminds us many of the childhood vaccines we just take for granted today.
Like measles, mumps.
Yeah, those ones. They were originally tested using placebo trials way back when.
And now we have decades and decades of data showing they're safe and effective.
Right. Decades of widespread use, tons of data. Their safety and efficacy profiles are really well established.
So it seems like there's a spectrum of approaches, depending on whether you're talking about something totally new, like the first COVID shots, versus an update, versus something that's been around for ages.
It seems that way. And this new policy appears to be pushing for that really rigorous initial standard, the placebo trial maybe even, for things that we might currently consider just updates.
Okay, so let's circle back then to those big kind of looming questions that the article leaves us with.
Yeah, the unknowns.
Top of the list, still that definition of new. What specific criteria will HHS actually use?
Right. Will it depend on how novel the technology is, or how much the antigens have changed, or something else entirely?
We just don't know yet. And tied to that, what's the potential impact on timelines?
Ah, yeah. Getting updated vaccines out?
If every single annual update, let's say for flu or COVID, needs a full placebo-controlled trial, what does that do to our ability to react quickly to new variants or strains?
Could it slow things down significantly? The development, the rollout, that seems like a critical question.
It really does. And finally, the article points out we're still waiting on the details of how and when this policy actually gets implemented.
Right. The nuts and bolts, the guidelines, the start date, all still TBD, to be determined.
Lots of missing pieces.
So if we try to synthesize it all, what we have is this new HHS policy clearly driven by Secretary Kennedy. It marks a potentially major shift towards requiring placebo-controlled trials for vaccines classified as new. And while the stated goal seems to be ensuring, that gold standard of science and how we evaluate vaccines,
Right, that rigorous approach.
there are still these really substantial uncertainties, especially around what new actually means and what the practical consequences might be down the line.
It definitely prompts a lot to think about, doesn't it? You've got, on one side, this argument for the absolute most robust data possible, that gold standard idea.
Yeah, the push for certainty.
But then on the other side, you have to weigh the potential real-world impacts. Like, how quickly can we adapt our vaccines if the process becomes much longer or more complex?
Yeah.
Especially when we're dealing with viruses that mutate all the time.
It's a definite tension there. Which maybe leads to a final thought for you, the listener, to mull over.
Okay.
How might this policy, assuming we get clarity on its scope eventually, how might it actually reshape the landscape of vaccine development and public health more broadly in the coming years?
Yeah. What could be maybe the unforeseen advantages of this radical departure, and what challenges, maybe ones we haven't even thought of yet, might pop up?
A lot to watch unfold, for sure.